daggers in the crowds, rebellion in the name of God. Judea seethes under the heel of mighty Rome. Religious duty collides with political domination. Out of this powder keg emerge the Zealots, daring dissidents and defenders of the faith, torchbearers of nationalism cloaked in spiritual garb, willing to go to any lengths to resist the imperial eagle defiling their promised land. In this episode, we'll probe the rise of this militant movement raging against occupation, allegiance to no sovereign but Yahweh alone. Yet, in their no-holds-barred war against earthly powers, how far into extremism will the Zealots plunge? What lessons emerge as faith fuses with fanaticism? And how will their vision of divine deliverance ultimately be upended? My name is Jared Luchabor, a graduate of Mid-America Reformed Seminary and a lover of church history. Join me as we highlight the complex zealot fury fueling the flames in first century Judea, their call to arms, their craving for a warrior Messiah, and how Jesus confounded their expectations of power turned upside down through the cross on today's episode of the Church History Project. First century Judea was a powder keg waiting to explode. Bitter divides plagued the Jewish community and foreshadowed the coming chaos and rebellion. Religious tensions ran high, with groups competing for power and influence among the people, leading to resentment and mistrust. Politically, unrest stirred as many chafed under the rule of Roman procurators and the Roman occupation more broadly, seen by some as an affront to Jewish sovereignty in their ancestral lands. Further complicating matters were drastic socioeconomic disparities between the elite Jewish aristocracy, often aligned with the Romans, and poor peasants struggling under high taxes and few opportunities. Resentment festered. In the growing bitterness, radical voices at the fringes gained traction by tapping into anger against the status quo. This was the precarious backdrop as the Zealot movement began to take shape, a particularly militant group vowing to fight back against Roman rule. The origin of the word zealot can be traced back to the ancient Greek term zelotes, a word that encapsulated the meanings of an emulator, fanatic, admirer, or follower, someone consumed by fervent passion for a person, ideal, or cause. A zealot pursues their beliefs with burning enthusiasm, often in excess and without regard for moderation. Such was the case for the Zealots of the Second Temple period in Judea. In the year 6 AD, when Judea had recently been incorporated as a Roman province after the banishment of the ethnarch Archelaus, a census was ordered by Rome to assess the region's populace and holdings. This census, conducted under the supervision of the governor of Syria, Quirinius, was met with great resentment by the Jewish inhabitants of Judea. To them, this census represented not merely an administrative task, but an affront to their sovereignty and religious customs, being forced upon them soon after their nation had lost even a degree of self-rule. In response to what was seen as an implicit first step toward further subjugation under pagan rule, a resistance movement coalesced under the leadership of Judas of Galilee. With fiery oratory and unyielding commitment to Jewish independence, Judas exhorted the populace to civil disobedience, urging them to refuse participation in the census as a defiant statement that Judea answered to no power other than God. This founding creed of refusing to acknowledge or collaborate with the occupying Romans would inspire Judas's followers, the Zealots, in their militant fight for Jewish liberty over the coming decades, cementing their role as agitators against foreign rule. From small beginnings, the Zealot movement would grow over years of simmering violent rebellion to play a major role in the eventual Jewish revolt, drawing upon Judas of Galilee's uncompromising example. The Zealots represented a sect of Judaism willing to go to extreme lengths to uphold and defend their faith and way of life. We saw the Greek root of the word zealot, but their name derives from the Hebrew word kanaim, meaning those who are zealous on behalf of God, a reference to their fiery passion and commitment to God's law, known as the Torah. As defenders of the Torah, the Zealots vigorously opposed any perceived threat to the Mosaic Code or Jewish customs. They sought to preserve the integrity of their religion against the influences of Hellenism and Roman paganism that pervaded Judea under Seleucid and later Roman rule. Tension simmered in Jerusalem when imperial decrees from Rome ran counter to Jewish customs. Such discord reached a crisis point after Caligula, the Roman emperor from 37 to 41 AD, commanded a statue bearing his likeness be erected in the Jerusalem temple. To the Jews, this edict represented the utmost sacrilege, an idolatrous contamination of their holiest site. Zealous factions mobilized, prepared to resist any effort to enforce the order with violent defiance. But upon Caligula's sudden death, the immediate threat vanished. In this circumstance, the Zealots championed armed resistance in the name of God to safeguard their spiritual identity. As the years passed, their anger and resentment slowly hardened, not just towards the Romans, but even towards those among their own people who sought accommodation or cooperation with the occupying power. In their unbending opposition, the Zealots ultimately turned on any Jews deemed guilty of collaboration, their fury crossing into fanaticism. Out of the Zealots, there emerged an even more extreme and violent faction, the Sicarii, or Daggermen. Methodical in their mayhem, they specifically targeted Romans and even fellow Jews regarded as Roman sympathizers, an ever-widening circle. Fueled by revolutionary fervor, they launched repeated ambushes in the streets against soldiers and officials, often in broad daylight amidst crowds, only to slip away using concealed daggers. Their destabilizing attacks and campaign of calculated terror intensified tensions and conflicts in Judea. The Zealots eagerly awaited the arrival of the Messiah, whom they fervently believed would lead them into battle against the Roman occupiers and expel all foreign nations from Judea. In their minds, only shows of force could hasten the coming of the one true king, who would break the shackles of oppression and usher the chosen people into an era of independence and glory. Their fantasy of a militaristic Messiah was uniquely shaped by years of resistance and resentment towards the imposition of Roman might. It reflected their longing to restore power to Jerusalem, which, in their eyes, had been unjustly stripped away by heathen outsiders. Their fervent anticipation of a liberator who would lead the charge against the empire was fueled by the injustices that they had tirelessly struggled against. From the Zealots' vantage point, the Messiah was destined to fulfill the words of prophets by serving as a vessel for divine wrath against the persecutors of Israel. For the Zealots, only one ending was acceptable: the end of Rome's grip over the Promised Land. The tumultuous times of the first century saw no shortage of would-be messiahs and revolutionaries arising to resist the yoke of Roman occupation. Though introduced earlier in this episode, his person bears repeating. Judas of Galilee was a rabble-rouser of considerable influence. This dissident is notably referenced by name in the book of Acts, chapter 5, verse 37, leaving a mark on the biblical record. As we saw, Judas incited his compatriots to rebellion when, around 6 AD, the Romans imposed a census in Judea in order to more efficiently tax the populace. Enraged at this affront to Israel's autonomy and priestly purity, Judas exhorted the people to refuse to register with the heathen authorities. Those who nonetheless complied often found their homes razed and livestock stolen by his zealous followers. Judas found a powerful ally in the Pharisee Zadok, who lent religious legitimacy to the earthly goal of throwing off Rome's oppression for good. Freedom and independence became the rallying cries for their movement, which considered paying any tribute to Caesar an abomination and the use of violence fully justified. Fast forward many years later, after Jesus' death and resurrection, the book of Acts recounts how the Pharisee Gamaliel preempted any rash actions by the Sanhedrin against the controversial New Jesus movement by drawing on the cautionary tale of Judas and his uprising. Gamaliel, in reflecting upon Judas of Galilee, mentions that, though initially it attracted many devotees, this rebellion born of worldly nationalist aspirations ultimately failed. Judas himself perished and his followers scattered. Just as fatal human pride and recklessness had caused the undoing of Judas's revolt, Gamaliel suggested that if this Jesus movement was similarly man-made, frustration and futility would eventually cause it to self-destruct. But if it was from God, no earthly authorities could hope to overthrow it. His practical advice prevailed, dissuading the Sanhedrin from heavy-handed crackdowns, paving the way for the spread of the gospel and of Christ's people. Among the disciples gathered by Jesus Christ were men of diverse histories, united by their faith in him as the Messiah. Less renowned today, yet no less devoted, was Simon, surnamed the Canaanite or the Zealot. Scholars debate whether he belonged to the Zealot faction or simply bore their fervor for the Jewish cause. Whatever his past allegiance, the fire of zealotry must have burned hotly for Simon to gain such a surname. If Simon was indeed a zealot partisan, sworn to revolt against Roman rule, as a disciple commissioned by Christ to go forth into the world, he would become a tireless warrior for the kingdom of heaven. Though his zealous nature did not fade, it was now kindled with spreading the light of the gospel. His past life trained him in discipline and valor, virtues he could now lend to the service of his Savior and Lord. Once committed to armed rebellion against the Romans, the zealot Simon would become an unrelenting soldier for Christ. The Zealots emerged from history as a complex movement, champions of Jewish nationalism and guardians of religious purity, yet also fanatics plunging Judea into chaos. Their uncompromising fight against Roman oppression was fueled by devotion to God's law and to their ancestral homeland. Yet in their battle against earthly powers, even targeting fellow Jews deemed traitors, their methods grew increasingly extreme. As followers of Jesus Christ, what lessons can we glean from the Zealots' fiery story? For one, we see the dangers of fusing divine purposes with violence, how easily political grievances or injured pride can be baptized as spiritual causes. Reform often starts at the margins through agitation against injustice, yet lasting change requires non-violent means that conquer hearts with the message of the gospel. More broadly, the Zealots reflect the human longing for a heroic rescuer, for God to visibly champion his people against the schemes of oppressors. The Zealots awaited a fierce Messiah to crush Israel's enemies, yet Jesus confounded such expectations. His was a path of upside-down power and transformation on the inside. He absorbed hatred and violence while preaching love for enemies. As Christians, we know God often works through the small and quiet, not just the bold and spectacular. What the Zealots saw as divine wrath and deliverance took an unexpected form, a Messiah on a cross. Out of despair came resurrection hope, by which the kingdom of God subverts the logic of this age and whose radiant glory will never fade. As we bear the turmoil of injustice with resilient faith, we await the return of the Prince of Peace to make all things new. With eyes fixed on the horizon, we yearn for the day when the heavens open and every knee shall bow before the King of Kings. On that long-hoped dawn, the judging sword proceeds from his mouth, and his kingdom comes in its fullness. Until then, we carry the sword of truth and walk as beacons of light, keeping our lamps filled and wicks trimmed in steady anticipation of the consummation of this age, knowing Christ will make all things right. Next week, we'll look at the last of the 4 Jewish factions during the Second Temple period, the mystically inclined Essenes. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out through social media platforms or through email, which you can find in the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoyed today's discussion, consider leaving a review. I'm Jared Luchabor. This has been an episode of the Church History Project.